Welcome to this episode of Kennedy Saves the World. It is at this point in February where the oppressive weather, the constant gray, the drizzle, the changing moods of the winds and precipitation really start to grind on people's mental health. And this is when so many people are desperate for sunshine, they're desperate for change. Their body is telling them that they need a shift in order to survive, because so many people, and I don't know if we are in the middle of a mental health crisis or people are just better and less ashamed and less stigmatized to talk openly about their mental health and struggles they have with things like anxiety and depression and just feeling generally overwhelmed. But it really feels like there is a correlation between this point in the year and this point in our winter, no matter where you live, and how you feel your sense of mental well-being. What is the science behind it? And more importantly, what can we do to make ourselves feel better? There is no better person to turn to than my good friend, Dr. Drew Pinsky, who is a board-certified physician and addiction specialist who has been dealing in areas, the overlap between the medical community and mental health for decades now, doing incredible research, but more importantly, being an amazing communicator in terms of identifying what is not right and how to make it better. Dr. Drew, welcome back to the podcast.
Kennedy, I don't know why anybody would be anxious because you're here to save the world.
Exactly right.
How can we be anxious?
You would think that would be anxiety provoking in and
be
of
enough.
itself. I will not shrug as I have the world on my shoulders.
Oh my gosh, there's a lot packed into that.
That's right.
So next up, Ayn Rand. Why don't we review our history really quickly so people understand our connection? Because I think it's interesting that we've known each other since 1994 or something, right?
1990.
90.
Yes. So I started actually in 91. It was early 91. I started interning at KROQ, the world famous KROQ in Los Angeles, as an unpaid intern. I was 18 years old, just a few months out of high school. And Dr. Drew had just finished medical school, and he was co-hosting a really popular, funny medical show where people, it was mostly teenagers, would call in and ask questions about their genitalia. And it was hosted by Dr. Drew and a music DJ, this wild guy named Poor Man. And so I used to drive around going to Jack in the Box late at night on Sunday nights from 10 to midnight, and I would listen to the show, and I would just keep driving because I wanted to hear what Dr. Drew had to say. And then when I got to be an intern at KROQ, I would sneak into the building so I could talk to Dr. Drew about my stomach issues, and then we became friends. Then I was promoted to being a DJ and then went to MTV. Drew took Loveline to MTV, and then you and I did a pilot together in 2000.
Yes. I forgot about that piece of our history. There's so much else, but yes.
Called The Group, where it was basically group therapy, and they didn't pick up the pilot because there are fools in syndicated television.
Yes.
But Drew obviously has gone on to work with Adam Carolla for years in various iterations.
And Adam, I remember you sitting in the studio with us because I think they gave it for a brief period when I started doing radio with Adam. I think you had a shift that followed us, right?
Yes. So yes. So I was doing the overnights before I went to MTV. I was doing the overnights on KROQ.
Like right before.
Yes, from 91 to the fall of 92. And I would get to the studio early. My shift started at 1. Loveline ended at midnight, and there would be like an hour interlude. And I would get there early if you guys had great guests. And I remember meeting the Red Hot Chili Peppers and the Beastie Boys for the first time because they were on Loveline.
You know what else is weird? I was watching Tom Green's documentary, and our mutual manager, Howard Lapidus, is in that documentary. Yes, and Jackie Stern, who was his assistant and now took over his job, was figuring large in that documentary. And I started thinking about those days, and I got involved with Howard because of you. He came in with you one night when you were actually a guest on Loveline because of MTV. You came in as a guest, and he pulled me aside and goes, "What do you want to be doing in 10 years?" And I thought to myself, this is the comedy. The thought bubble over my head, which I did not say out loud. This was now 1996, maybe 97. Thought bubble over my head was, well, certainly not this. I was like, no way. I'll be practicing medicine somewhere. I had no plan to do media as long as I've done it. And let's be fair, that was 30 years ago. Crazy.
But Howard had an incredible way. So when I first met Howard and his partner, professional partner, Rick Bernstein, I went in to interview because Howard's fiancée at the time, Maria D'Arcangelo, who eventually became Maria Lapidus,
Yep.
I was her assistant on the Kevin and Bean show. And I had screwed something up. So she was like, you need to go to my fiance Howard and his partner and interview to be their assistant. And because I needed a job because my internship at KROQ was ending. So I went into Howard and Rick's office and had this great meeting with them. I'm like, they're totally going to hire me to be their assistant. And they had me write down a prospective salary. And I was like, I'm going to highball them. So I wrote down $22,000 a year. And Howard folded up the number and put it in his pocket. And he said, I'm going to do you a favor. He said, you are so much fun to talk to. It would be great to have you in this office. You are going to be a star. Here's what you need to do. You need to go back to Andy Schoen, who was the program director at KROQ. You need to tell Andy Schoen that Howard Lapidus said to put you on the air immediately. So I went back. I walked into Andy's office unannounced. And I told him that, and he said, I will give you a 2-night audition here at KROQ. You can do 2 nights on the overnight from 1 to 5:30 in the morning. And if you're any good, I will hire you to be a part-time DJ. And he had Louis Largent, who had an FCC license, run my board for 2 nights. And then that's how I got hired to be a part-time DJ at KROQ. And then Andy left MTV or left KROQ for MTV.
And Louis and you.
And took Louis Largent and me with him.
Yeah, crazy. Howard did a lot of that for a lot of people. He certainly did that for me, those kinds of things. And I have deep, deep appreciation and gratitude. There are other people that sort of, they're not really aware of what he did for them, I think. And so God rest his soul, as we say.
Yeah.
He was extraordinary talent himself.
And the biggest Buffalo Bills fan that you will ever meet. And, you know, I was really hoping and praying that the Bills got into the Super Bowl so Howard could watch on the big screen in the sky. But here we are. You and I are both still broadcasting. We're still trying to see the good in things, see the truth in things, be objective observers of what is happening in, you know, our crazy culture, which has morphed so much politically and sociologically. And, you know, I still turn to you for answers on things because you have such a methodical way of filtering the nonsense out and giving people what they really want. And
I have all this I would tell this part of the history too, which I'm very also grateful that I had this immense clinical experience. I mean, that of a nature that no single physician gets any longer. What I did was I was doing critical care medicine. So I was managing ventilators and using wires to go on people's hearts and things in the morning, and then doing hospital rounds, and then doing outpatient medicine. And then around 2 p.m, I would go to the psychiatric hospital where I managed their medical services and then ultimately took over their addiction services. So I got to see the entirety of the human experience in as intense and extreme circumstances as you can imagine. And as a result of that, I've come up with I have a pretty good instinct on things because I've just seen it all. I've seen everything, and I'm deeply grateful for it. I want to give it back now. But as a result, I kind of understand the human experience. I kind of understand it in ways that you can't understand it unless you've been sitting in the rooms I've been sitting in all these years.
Yes. And when did you realize that there was a more profound overlap between our physiology and our mental health?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question. I would say I marched into the psychiatric hospital as the new young internist. And so I was doing mostly the medical care of psychiatric patients, and I became sort of an expert in that. And it was immediately clear from that perspective that somewhere between 20 and 40% of every admission to the hospital had either an underlying medical problem causing or contributing to the psychiatric symptoms, or caused by the psychiatric pathology. They were into some problems that they got medically, or the psychiatric medication were causing medical problems. But the medical piece was profound. Then, as time went along, and as we moved through what I think was an era of profound childhood trauma, you mentioned Loveline. I mean, that was all we talked to, was traumatized individuals. And we destroyed our families. We over-sexualized children. We just traumatized young people. And when you do so, they develop emotional dysregulation in their adulthood. They reenact the traumas of the past in their interpersonal lives. And it became clear through the field of what's called interpersonal neurobiology that evolved in the late 90s, guys like Alan Shore and Peter Fonagy and Dan Siegel, that the decade of the brain, which was the 90s, right? If you remember that was the decade of the brain.
Yeah, and it was also the rise of Prozac. That was the first.
That's right. We medicalized psychiatry almost entirely.
Yes.
Mistake. But it also became exquisitely clear that we made a huge mistake, that the brain is embedded in an autonomic nervous system. That autonomic nervous system and brain is embedded in a body. That body is embedded in relationships. Those relationships are embodied in a family, which is embodied in a community, which is embodied in a socio-cultural moment of history. And that is all important in the human experience. And if you don't understand and take in all of that, you're going to miss what the subtleties and actually the richness of what's going on with the human being. And you just mentioned, I'll throw weather in there too. You're right. Yeah. That seasonal affective disorder has a huge effect on our moods.
So when I went to therapy twice. Once when I was 18, which I found to be very helpful. But then when I left MTV, and you and I had talked about this, and I've talked about this a lot on this podcast, I developed crippling anxiety. So I had generalized anxiety disorder and
You're here. Likewise.
Panic disorder.
Panic. I had panic. Yep, I had both. Panic's fun, isn't it? It's awesome.
But I was prone to panic. My first panic attack happened, really for no reason when I was 6. And I remember it so clearly. I remember that feeling of wanting to run away. And I ran into a neighbor's yard. And then when my heart rate kind of calmed down and I calmed down, I walked back to school and I was like, well, that was weird. So I saw a therapist who changed my life because she told me, she said, I can either give you skills or pills. And I was like, I don't know what that means. So she developed a form of their therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, which is very patient-led, but it also, it's very practical. So one of the things she taught me to rewire my brain, for lack of a better term, was meditation, which became very, very important for me to teach my brain how to be calm when there was input, because what I was doing was I was taking the input, which oftentimes was physiological and not necessarily psychological distress. And when I say that, I mean, it could be PMS. It could be having too much caffeine late at night. And then when I would try and sleep, I would wake up with a panic attack. It could be, taking Sudafed. So I became so physically reactive to that kind of stuff that it set off a chain in my brain, and I had to learn to override that through meditation and externalizing my worries. So for the generalized anxiety, she had me write down my worries at the same time for the same amount of time every day, even if I didn't have any worries. If she said I didn't have any worries, which was impossible because I'm a ruminator, that I just had to write the same thing over and over again for 20 minutes. And
OCD folds into this too.
Yeah. And
OCD symptoms also.
And then, so I had to do all of that stuff, even on days when I felt great, which was really, really important for me. And I had to, take 10 months and really, it was very hard work, but through talk therapy and the skills that she gave me, I was able to come to an equilibrium and develop a less reactive brain. And she said I was the most physically reactive patient that she had ever treated, that I would be really great in hypnosis, and it would be very helpful if I wanted to have a natural childbirth. She also told me that having a religious system would be very helpful and would help me manage my anxiety long term over the course of my life. And she said, she was not pushing that as a religious person, that she was saying this is what the data
Is it religious or
bears out.
spiritual? Did you say
No, she said
religious?
that it had to be a practice. It had to be a regular practice. I'm sure you can call it
Well, I mean,
spirituality.
12-step is a practice, so fair enough,
Yes, but it had to be something that you adhered to, that was greater than you, that you believed
Yeah.
in.
Very important piece of this always. It's
Yes,
crazy, as particularly as you move into sort of thriving zone. Once your symptoms subside and you're trying to make meaning again and engage and thrive, some sort of spiritual something always figures in.
yes.
She's so DBT. It's a relatively new form of therapy. It's a good one, as you see it worked. You're describing stuff I've got too, which is panic, anxiety, OCD. It all kind of goes. There's different flavors of anxiety, right? There's the OCD flavor, and then there's the affective or depressive version of
Hmm.
anxiety, where people who get depressed get anxious, or people that get anxious get depressed. Those tend to be alcoholics, in fact. And there's different ways to approach this nowadays.
That's
And you're
interesting because I definitely I've never so I've always thought,
mm,
just based on my own experience, like I run anxious and I
mm,
know people who tend to run depressed. And
mhm,
my anxiety tends to like speed me up, which I
mhm,
think leads to panic.
mhm.
Whereas I know people who get anxious and they withdraw, which
Yeah.
I think is more an expression of depression.
Correct. And those people, if they have the gene for alcoholism, tend to drink to prevent the depression from coming in. You and I are the more OCD flavor of this. So as we were growing up, probably had some OCD symptoms as well. So there's sort of so DBT, a great way to approach it. Exposure therapy. For your and my flavor of anxiety, exposure therapy works really well.
Explain what that is.
It's where you essentially are. This is a bad version. The simple version is that you are just exposed to the stimulus that creates the anxiety, or if you're having obsessive thoughts, you're exposed to those thoughts, or if you're afraid of, if you have phobias, you're exposed to those things in tolerable doses, with hand in hand with somebody who attunes to you and is present with you while you work your way through these things. And a relative of that is just sort of attunement therapy, which
Mhm.
is what I did for many years because I had PTSD and trauma, I had an abusive mom, and
Mhm.
I didn't get the back and forth that kids needs to develop a cohesive regulatory system and a robust connection with their primary emotions. And you're describing some of that too. When what comes out of the body is kind of disorganized and scary, that shouldn't happen. That should have been managed in childhood. And there are many ways to deal with that. DBT is a way, EMDR, which is a sort of a hypnotic kind of therapy, great. Leaning in is a way, so exposure therapy. And as you said, some sort of mindfulness practice, very good.
Oh, the
So there's
mindfulness was
they're
so
very
good for
great.
me.
Yeah.
I
See,
mean,
for me, I get more anxious with mindfulness. I start to spin, so I have to. I'm getting there. I'm trying that stuff myself right now because these things are chronic, right? They never
yes.
they
And
go away.
that's
This is sort of our tone, so to speak.
yes, and
You're
that's what she explained to me
yeah,
was you're always going to have this.
yeah,
But the point is to manage the edges of it so you can use the essence of what you have to be creative and compassionate. But when
exactly.
things get out of control and it affects either, your habits, your working life, your family life, if what you're doing starts to interfere with your personal relationships,
You're functioning.
yes,
Functioning.
that's when you have to manage it with more intense systems like the types of therapy you just laid out. Now, when you talk about exposure therapy, does that also include MDMA? Because I know people have been kind of crapping all over that stuff.
Yeah.
Um, for
So MDMA is an interesting thing. I'm blanking on the guy's name. That's the head of the
MAPS,
yeah,
yeah,
MAPS, exactly. And he's the one that did the research. It was well done research. It was positive research. It showed
Doblin,
Doblin, that's his
yes.
name. Yeah. And it showed that it did work. And I wasn't surprised actually. But he said, look, it is for recalcitrant PTSD, and the therapists he didn't trust almost any other therapist to be able to do the kind of work necessary to make this effective. So it's still kind of, this stuff will be useful one day. We just have to work our way through exactly where, how, what the risk reward are. But I want to get into something you just had mentioned about thriving again, and about this fact that we have this sort of tone to our nervous system, right? I have PTSD. I didn't get what I needed. I had to have lots of therapies to develop that connection. Thank God I've got it, but it's still kind of distant and it's not as robust as it should have been. But I want you to help me with this because it's a philosophical point, because I get into trouble with this all the time, is all these terms that we toss around are neutral in my mind. They are neither pejorative nor advantageous. They're pejorative in certain situations. They're negative, so to speak, when they start to affect functioning, work or school, finance, health, legal, relationships. They are positive, as you mentioned, when you are needing to be, like for me, my OCD, when I go back and check a patient's charts 3 times, that's good for me to check and double check and double check. And also because of my PTSD, I'm very empathic and I'm very attuned to other people. It drifts into codependency, so I have to be careful. So no single term in psychiatry, in my mind, is strictly pejorative. So when I will use terms about personalities, narcissists, borderline, things like that, they're just terms in my mind. But people go, oh, how dare you call me that?
Yes.
And I really have a problem with us putting a valence on these clinical terms. Alcoholism, it's not or drug addict. That's not a look. If we were in a war right now, you want the alcoholic and drug addict up front. They are at their best in extreme circumstances. That's why that gene has survived throughout human existence, because they are extraordinary in extraordinary circumstances. But quiet times, access, dysregulation gets into trouble, and they can do some nasty stuff. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a thing. It's part of the human experience.
But so after studying evolutionary biology in college, I was always intrigued by the things that we're selected for to survive. The things like borderline personality disorder,
Well,
and alcoholism. And, when
alcoholism makes perfect sense to me. Alcoholism is a survivor gene. They make great fighter pilots, great extreme athletes, great infantry. And they'll tell you. Well, I give lots of lectures to alcoholics, and I'll always ask them, what would happen if a bunch of Huns came over the hill right now? And they went, I'd go at them. I'd go fight. You really? Not the here is running the other way. So, but they're like, no, pick up a chair and I go at it. Like, evidently in extreme and particularly multi-generational assaults, military assaults, they're the ones that survive. Wow. And in isolated populations, which is how you make a gene emerge, then you really see lots of alcoholism when these populations are distressed repeatedly. But yeah, the borderline personality, one of the theories about that is that they are the canary in the coal mine, that they are so attuned externally that if something is wrong in the environment, they start to freak out. And if you're in a small group, that could be helpful if there's a leopard moving towards the troop.
That's interesting. Don't go anywhere. More Kennedy Saves the World right after this. I didn't know if there was a correlation between those two and, genetic fitness, for lack of a better term. But, back to the idea.
Alcoholics are more fit. Alcoholics are more fit. Borderlines, it's hard because they could get used by the group, but they tend to die young.
Interesting. And sad. But hopefully more treatable now than it was 20 years ago.
Oh yeah, and DBT is a very fine way to treat borderline.
Yeah, it was created by Marsha Linehan, my former therapist, because she was institutionalized with borderline personality disorder, and this was the system that she created to get herself out of the institution, and it worked. And then she went to college, and she went and became a therapist. She got her PhD and created a system and developed a name for it and an organization for it. She knew it already worked, but she had to have the higher training in order to put a name to it and to teach it to other people. But she developed it to get herself out of an institution and then free other people of the prison that, And she was very kind in helping me identify a borderline in my family. And of
Mm.
course, the hypochondria in me was like, "Do I have borderline? Because I see how destructive this is." And she said, "No, you're generalized anxiety and panic disorder, or you'll cross the bear, and you will always have to use the skills in some way to come to baseline when things are stressful in your life."
It's interesting. My therapist said, I spent most of my career dealing with people who grew up with or live with borderlines and narcissists. And yeah, it's hard to be in a relationship with people with those proclivities. It's hard. And again, most of the time when we're talking about people with these conditions, we're really talking about traits, not disorders, because the traits are very common these days.
That's the word that's misused. And Howie Mandel was talking about this the other day. He's like, OCD is,
Yeah.
it's terrifying and it's overwhelming. It's not someone whose office is very clean. When someone is hygienic, don't tell them that they have OCD.
Yeah.
That's a misuse of the term, but it is the disorder, because a lot of people can have these traits. And I think there's a difference in what you were saying between nouns and adjectives. Like, you can describe aspects of someone's personality without ascribing a label to them,
Well,
which,
I was going to say, yeah, and we are over labeling, unfortunately. I'm guilty as anybody. And people are labeling themselves and then dismissing things because of that label, or misrepresenting themselves because of that label. That is an unfortunate outcome. And we are a highly traumatized population. I mean, look, just think about this, Kennedy. Who came to this country? People did not come to this country because things were going well, because they were usually, almost without exception, people who were in extreme circumstances, were highly traumatized, or were traumatized in their family of origin, and were trying to escape, and they came here. And then the really crazy ones thought they would put their family in a wagon and take them out to California or somewhere along the way. You wonder why we have a lot of stuff going on out
yeah.
west,
But
because
then,
that's how it went.
okay, but then, so the problem is twofold from that, because it's like, my family came over on a boat with one suitcase from Romania, fleeing the commies. They gave up everything. They had no idea what this country would hold for them.
Where did the Greek come in?
Oh no, I'm Romanian, so I'm half Romanian, but always went to the Greek church, because when I was growing up, there was only a Greek Orthodox church in Portland. It wasn't until
Oh,
later that we got a Romanian Orthodox church, and then I studied Greek at UCLA and studied
uh,
in Greece, and have always loved.
okay. And you got to give me that phrase again about the Greek exists in your heart.
Yes, Din Kardia ime Ellenika. So that means,
In
in
me,
my heart,
Hellenica.
I am Greek, which I
Hellenica is Greek.
love that phrase. But so, it's like, part of me is like, you guys, you think you had it tough? Like, toughen up, suck it up. Think of what your grandmother went through. I tell my girls that. And
Hmm.
so it's like,
Your daughters seem great, by the way.
they're,
So you're
they're,
doing it. It's working.
they're lovely. They're both completely different from each other. I
Mm.
love them so much, and I'm so thankful that they communicate with me. Like
Mm.
that, I think that's what makes me so happy, is they both talk to me about their feelings and their friend groups, and
But it's the dividends of therapy you did, frankly,
my
and your good parenting and hard parenting, of course. But the fact that you did the emotional work is what made you available to them in the way they needed you.
what was really important to me, especially when they were babies, was self-soothing. Because that was one of the things that I was lacking,
Mm.
that my therapist helped me with. And that was
Mm.
part of the panic, was the inability to go, "Oh, this is actually okay. You're okay. You're not dying. Your heart's not going to beat out of your chest. You're not going to stop breathing. You're okay." And I had to learn that. And so it was very important to me that my children were able to do that. But part
Mhm.
of it was, we tell them to suck it up. But the other part, and Kat identified this in her most recent book, we talk about mental health so much, and we advertise our trauma so much,
Mhm.
but don't fix it. And we don't talk about
Right.
how to
Well,
fix it and
and
what that looks
and
like.
and I told you that exposure is a very hot way to treat things now because it's so effective. We're doing the opposite of exposure. We're isolating people from the stimulus, putting them in safe spaces. That is how you make somebody sick. That is how you make mental illness. We're like cultivating it in this culture. I think finally we're moving the other way, but man, was that destructive.
Well, I want people to take away from this. I want them to look into ways if they're not feeling good, if things are not functioning, look into therapeutic systems, and that ranges from mindfulness to exposure therapy. But I really want to explore what exposure therapy is, because if that's the next frontier and that's the thing that can help
Yeah.
a greater number of
I have
people.
I have great resources for you. It's called NoCD, NOCD, and No OCD, is a website that has great therapists. They're also IOCDF.org, the International Obsessive Compulsive Disorder Federation. Wonderful, but probably the best single diagnosis, patient-oriented website ever, and community, and lots of education there about these. It was sort of invented through the OCD world, but it's been used in many other contexts, particularly phobias and anxiety, but also mood, other things, panic for sure. And we live in a very anxious time, and so anxiety is a common thing, and we need to learn to regulate. But the thing, Kennedy, I think that is losing, this most lost, is most inapparent in our culture, is the emphasis on thriving and meaning making. Humans are meaning making machines. We must find a spiritual something that involves making meaning of our lives. And typically that meaning making involves service of some type. It's critical that we get back to that.
That's beautifully said. And those are things that I'm going to take away, that I'm going to talk to my daughters and my partner about. And I appreciate you so much, Dr. Drew. You are an incredible force, and you really are saving the world. I'm just flapping my gums, and I'm happy you are here.
I'm happy to be here and happy to be your friend.
Thank you, dear. This has been Kennedy Saves the World, along with Dr. Drew. I'm Kennedy. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.
Oh, go ahead and leave me a review while you're there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. You've been listening to Kennedy Saves the World on the Fox News Podcast Network.